Welcome to Play to Your Best, a series of incredible interviews, if I do say so myself, on mindset, nutrition, training, recovery. I am having a blast, and we have the incredible Christopher Johnson with us today. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm not used to people calling me Christopher. I always just go by Chris, even though, my legal name is Christopher. Yeah, it sounds like my mom. Even she doesn't call me that.
Well, we've got Christopher in the house. Well, Chris, let me just introduce you a little bit. I want to just share how I came to you, and it's actually through one of my incredible athletes who's a physiotherapist and who put me onto you and said, hey, you got to know about this guy. He's doing awesome stuff. And I like to follow him. And I'm like, okay. And she was specifically doing your Return to Run program, which I now, through permission, use for all the athletes that are literally coming back into running. And just the way that you articulated things and how you're taking action and leading the way and being really just dynamic in how you portray it is why I am so excited that you're here. So yeah, I'm going to say a little bit more about you though. Cool. Just a little bit. All right. Are you ready? Okay. So yeah. So Chris is a physiotherapist, but what's interesting about him is that he did his education and then he took it to another level. And then he keeps on taking it to another level. So he went to New York, was with the world-renowned Nicholas Institute of Sports Medicine, took on, training, learning, working there for a number of years, opened up a physiotherapy clinic in Manhattan before you came to this beautiful part of the world called the Pacific Northwest. And it was for
Northwest. Yeah.
And it was because you wanted a different lifestyle, or tell us why you chose to come out here.
Well, funny enough, I always dreamed about being in the Pacific Northwest. When I was younger, I'd see images of just the lushness of it and, the rugged coast. And it was always sort of tugging at me. And I never anticipated moving away from the East Coast because I got very plugged in New York City. And but ended up meeting my partner, wife, Mimi there. And we got married out here in 2012. And I went back in late August and was living in a high rise in downtown Brooklyn. And, for anyone who has spent time on the East Coast, it's like a ghost town in the summer because everyone's at the shore, at the beach. And I was sitting there and I'm thinking, what in the hell am I doing here after having this amazing time out west? And when the dust settled after the wedding, we just made a decision to relocate to Seattle, which is where Mimi's parents are from.
Nice. So it was coming home for her, but a place that you've always had your heart tugged there. So that's awesome. Yeah. You since coming, you opened up a physiotherapy clinic then in Seattle, and but you've been really busy doing some other stuff as well. And you created Run Cadence, and this is really interesting. I just want to hear a little bit about this. It's an app that helps runners apply step rate manipulation to their training. That is really interesting to me. So can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's a very simple iOS app, and it's something that it's out there now. I mean, we're not going to do any updates to it. It was sort of an expensive undertaking. Anytime someone talks about creating an app like over dinner time, there's a lot that goes into it, and but it's a very practical app that helps runners apply the science of cadence or step rate manipulation to their training. And when you look at the research on cadence, it's the closest thing to a home run in the medical literature. And the whole idea is by increasing your step rate or the number of steps you take per minute while keeping your speed constant, it reduces the magnitude of loading, and it has effects at the hip, the knee, the shin, the foot and ankle. All it essentially does is it allows you to test your step rate. Yeah. And then it shows you what 2.5, 5, 7.5, and 10% above your preferred is. And it challenges you to adopt that when you're out on a run. So it's it relies on the accelerometer. So if you're running and the accelerometer or the metronome is quiet, it's telling you that you're in your desired step rate range. And if the metronome turns on when you're running, it's saying, okay, you're out of your range, pick it up. And once it senses you're in sync with it, it shuts off. So it's a what's considered bandwidth feedback. So it's very simple. And it's something that, a lot of clinicians and runners have gotten a lot of use out of. And the easiest way to conceptualize the benefits of step rate manipulation, imagine if you were pushing a cube down the street. It's sort of like you get it up on its side and it comes crashing down. You get it up on its side, comes crashing down. Well, what happens if you turn that cube or square into an octagon? So it's taking more turns, but the magnitude of each individual turn is less. And I just want to give a shout out to the people at the running clinic, JFS Schoulier and Blaise Dubois, and Kevin Maggs, who put a really nice video out showcasing that.
Yeah, maybe we can. I think it's really interesting because, well, what we're going to talk about today is looking at just the ton and the wealth of experience and learning that you've taken in to say, okay, so how, like what we're experiencing as movers and as exercisers and as athletes, however you want to define yourself in this life stage, is all the patterns that we may have been doing that have maybe not served us so well. We're coming, and then estrogen coming down. We're finding ourselves sometimes in patterns of injury. The collagen, our ligaments, our tendons, they're looser. They're not as strong. So therefore we are finding that our feet are flattening, and our hips, like everything just feels different. And so it's like an opportunity, and where I want to, kind of come into is like, okay, if we have an opportunity here, go say it like, nothing is the same, everybody. Let's start. And where's this starting point for us? And how do we, as females, like, what do we need to pay attention to when we're thinking about our bodies and assessing, okay, what are the most important things so that we can keep on going, or that we can be resilient and we can be strong in doing the sports that we love?
The conversation starts with childhood and adolescence. And I think that, for any young moms out there, to really realize that the greatest gift you can give your daughter as well as your son is bone health. And you have what's called a window of opportunity that's really up to your maybe early 20s, where we want to really optimize our bone health. So we know that a 10% increase in peak bone mass can delay osteoporosis by 13 years and decrease fracture risk by 50%. So this is a time where kids are also getting a lot of messages. They're starting to develop habits, some good, some bad. But once that ship has sailed, you can't really catch up. You can do things to promote bone health, but we really want to make sure that we're doing everything in our power to make sure that people are balancing their workloads, to make sure that they're getting sleep and they're fueling properly. And these are tricky conversations to have. So anytime I'm working with an athlete, I always want to say, okay, where is this woman coming from? All right. Mm-hmm. What was childhood like? Was she playing axial loaded sports? What was her menstrual function or status? How old was she when she got her period? Has she had regular menstrual function? Has that individual ever had a compromised relationship with food? Because you're really trying to paint this picture of what's their bone health. And I feel like a lot of the times, I work primarily in a physical therapy capacity. I do a lot of coaching as well. I really need to make sure I know who I'm dealing with, because that's going to dictate the focus of the program, obviously in accordance with that individual's goals. So, and I feel like these conversations get rushed a lot. And the pandemic has thrown a whole new wrench in things, because it's disrupted our typical lifestyles. And I think that right now, I can speak anecdotally on this, that I'm seeing a lot more bone stress injuries in people that probably would not have sustained them in the past had it not been for the pandemic.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah.
And that's because their lifestyle changed. They didn't get to gyms, or,
I think sleep has been disrupted. I think people are spending more time on social. They're withdrawn. They've been pulled away from their communities. and they're probably just not as active over the course of the day. I think of young students, whether it's high school, college, where they would be walking to and from class. Now they're just sitting in their dorms, but even if we think of, skeletally mature people, and females, will keep the focus there. I think that, activity levels have decreased. I bet you if we look at step counts, that they would have gone down. So there's a lot that's changed. And I think we're starting to see the sequel of that.
Yeah, it really, really, really interesting. Okay, so where do that's super interesting. So we start with looking at bone health. Where in our physical, what sort of injuries or what sort of things are you seeing among the athletes that are coming to you, say runners? I mean, running is a really big piece. I mean, you are also a triathlete, which, just warms my heart. Kona qualifier 3 times over. So that's not a bad, congratulations on that. But what are you seeing specifically in some of the challenges that females have? And then what would you recommend in sort of saying, if you're going to your physiotherapist or you're experiencing this would be the next step to try to start to discern how to move forward with your physiotherapist or with your strength trainer? Or how do we start to notice, like, oh, something's just not right? Is this a thing?
Yeah, so I think it's knowing who the athlete is presenting, what their primary complaint is, but also what's their ecosystem, right? So, I think of all the different hats my wife wears in terms of looking after the house, shuttling the kids around everywhere. I mean, there's so many moving parts. So I think if you fail to appreciate the backdrop and the ecosystems of one's life, that you're really not going to put yourself in the best position to troubleshoot with that individual. And I think the other thing that I was speaking about this over the weekend for a course that my buddy Joel Sackass and I taught, called Mastering the Geriathlete, is that women similar to geriathletes, when I say geriathlete, 55 and above, are just notoriously underloaded. So I look at, my wife just came back from going shopping. So she had all these grocery bags, and, I'm the bad husband who didn't go out to help her because I'm on this podcast, but I have a legitimate excuse. But she's doing a lot of stuff that's physically demanding. And I think when women connect with healthcare providers and trainers, I would say this is less the case with trainers, but a lot of healthcare providers will underload women, and that's not going to do them any favors. So I think just giving people low-level exercises that aren't going to create a stimulus, that are lower in contraction intensity. And we know that the tugging of muscle on bone creates a really gnarly stimulus for bone. So that's what I see a lot with the women who consult me. And just to sort of give people a lens into a lot of the complaints that master's level and geriathlete females, I tend to see a lot with proximal hamstring tendinopathy. So people, especially in the Northwest, a lot of the women I work with love trail running, and they'll get into trouble with like sit bone pain that really disrupts their training. I'll see a lot of lateral hip complaints. And I'll see some knee complaints. So, but the theme with a lot of these people who consult me after they've been spinning their wheels with an in-network provider is they're underloaded. And once we start challenging them in getting into greater contraction intensities, more intense exercise, they respond marvelously.
That's awesome. So this is coming into appropriate training, stimulus and loading, strength. And can you talk a little bit about how you, because you're also a coach. And so how are you balancing this idea of, so your PT hat is on. I mean, I get this a lot with our athletes. They go, like, if there's something going on, it's like, scope of practice, go to your PT. So they've got their PTF, their PT exercises, and then they have their strength exercises, and then they have their endurance exercises. And how is it that you, as a coach who gets to see it all, would recommend to the athlete and to the coaches that are listening to this to say, okay, well, how do we want to make sure they're loading. We want to make sure that they're doing their ancillary, work that is supporting and addressing whatever issue it is they're coming in. And the stimulus could look at two ways: cardiovascular stimulus, or we're looking at looking at like that sort of intensity, and then the foundational aerobic stimulus of, let's keep our metabolic health well. It's a big question. I know I've just asked you, but
yeah, I mean, I think it starts with when someone reaches out to me, I want to first say, are there any medical implications at play? And is this person reaching out because they have a primary complaint of pain and or a functional limitation? Because if that's the case, that's physical therapy, and I can't work with that person depending on where they are from a geographic standpoint, just because of the laws around this. Now, if someone's training in a healthy and consistent manner, they've proven to be a resilient and durable athlete, then the question starts to shift. Okay, is there any incomplete rehab in terms of your past medical history? So we'd need to really unpack that. And then just to say, what are your goals? What are your ambitions in terms of your sport? Is this person a runner? Are they a triathlete? Are they a master's level swimmer? So I think that really taking the time to know where someone is coming from, as well as what's point A, because we know point Z. Point Z is that individual's goals. It could be a Boston qualifying time. It could be maybe making it to 70.3 or Ironman World Championships. So we're trying to reverse engineer that, but I don't think folks always take the time to establish what point A is, which would require taking people through a battery of physical performance tests, and really taking the time to unpack their past medical history.
Right, because what you're doing is saying, okay, so you're running well now, or I'm trying to understand in this process. So you have a female athlete, they're going strong. They did absolutely, they had a history, but they have been working really hard. And now they want to start adding this idea of load onto them. And so help us understand a little bit of that process in which you're like, okay, so you are working on your strength. And can you give us any sort of specifics in terms of exercises or loading that would be supportive of that you really your go-tos?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that anytime that I start working with someone, I'm not going to come in and all of a sudden try and flip a million switches. I'm going to start maybe pulling one lever at a time and really try to identify what the low-hanging fruit is. So, if this is an athlete who's training in a consistent, healthy manner, fantastic. I want to make sure they stay on top of wellness factors, or they aren't being negatively impacted by the lees, which I'll credit Dan John with. So the leads are socially, emotionally, financially, psychologically. I need to understand where they are there before we start talking about manipulating variables related to the physical loads of training. With a lot of the women that I consult, you sort of alluded to this, they come in with this laundry list of exercises that they're doing. And I'm like, how do you have the time to get all of this done? There's no way. So I always want to get people focused on doing fewer things better, and I think that, any good training program should blend compound movements with some single leg drills, especially as they relate to the performance demands of a sport. If we take like running, for example, we need to get runners upright on the one leg. I mean, that's a performance requirement of the sport. But any good program should be grounded in fundamental human movements and then maybe customized based on someone's past medical history or if they currently have complaints. So what are the fundamental life or human movements? Push, pull, hinge, squat, carry, and then groundwork. All right. So that's nothing new. That's coming from Dan John. But these are movements and exercises that, again, are typically way underloaded. So if we take something like a squat, I would want most women to be working up to at least a squat with their body weight, if not 1.5 times that. And we have to be careful in terms of what decade we're talking about. Getting someone to deadlift their body weight, being able to carry, a percentage of their body weight in each hand. So my wife, for example, I mean, she's not a big woman, but she can hold 45-pound barbell plates in each hand comfortably and march it out. So this is a kind of stuff that, it involves taking the athlete through an assessment and anchoring them with also while avoiding leading them. So a lot of the times if I'm working with someone, I'll say, hey, we're going to talk about the squat exercise. I have all of these weights. I want you to pick a heavy, a medium, and a light weight, and I want to see what you come up with. And then let's take you through an anchoring process. Most of the time we're going to be shooting between 5 and 15 repetitions to bring about a meaningful strengthening stimulus for someone. So now, if you say, hey, I want you to pick a weight where you can confidently get 15 reps, you have all these weights, pick a weight, and I want to see what you do, as opposed to saying, hey, let's start you with a 20-pound dumbbell. Let people self-select, because I think a lot of the times coaches and clinicians have kinesiophobic beliefs themselves, things that they may think, oh, this person shouldn't be lifting that much. When if you let the person decide what weight to lift, they may pick something that's a lot more or a lot less than what you thought.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's really important.
Oh, that's super interesting. Yeah, and that's called anchoring, and that giving you a starting point to say, okay, from here we're going to move and assess where we need to go and keep going. One of the other things I wanted to ask you about is plyometrics and how those play into, because running is a plyometric exercise in and of itself in some way. So how are you balancing that sort of thinking out when you started saying bone health is so incredibly important? We know plyometrics is a part of that. How are you using that and thinking about it?
Yeah, so I tend to prioritize plyometrics. I'll use them throughout, across the age spectrum, but it's going to look a little bit different. So we know that bone responds well to high, odd, and unpredictable loads. We also know that if menstrual function is compromised, that you're not going to see the benefits of plyometric training. And that's a study that was recently put out by Richard Blagrove and his team. So this comes back to the fact that if you're not sleeping, you're not fueling, and you don't have these wellness factors right, that pretty much a lot of the discussion around training programs becomes a moot point. So when I'm incorporating plyometrics, I really tend to emphasize plyos with younger athletes, especially more explosive plyos. And then I will use plyometrics, as I mentioned, across the age spectrum, but they'll start to look a little bit different, where it's really that reactive strength. So stuff like jumping rope, but I would prioritize more like heavy, slow resistance and really creating a foundation of strength with master's level in geriathlete females. But with a lot of the younger women, I'm going to get them lifting heavy, but I also would probably challenge them with different flavor of plyometrics, stuff like counter movement jumps, broad jumps, vertical jumps, and really encourage them to take part in sports like basketball. Again, axial loaded sports that involve abrupt turning, twisting, starting, stopping, because that's really going to promote bone health too. So it's not just, if we talk about endurance athletes, running is not, it's not bad for your bones, but it's also not great when we look at the osteogenic index. So running's better than swimming and cycling, but it's not going to really create the stimulus that we're looking for in terms of bone. And the other thing too that's really important to emphasize is bone becomes deaf after a relatively low number of loading cycles. So, if you get into 40 loading cycles, bone becomes deaf to load, but then will become more responsive if you wait, say, 4 to 5 hours. So the timing of this stuff becomes really important too. I tend to prioritize if I'm doing plyos, I tend to incorporate those earlier on in the day when the bone's going to be a little bit more mechanosensitive to that kind of load. But the exercises they're not rocket science. I mean, they've done some amazing studies where they just have grade school kids walk up onto a platform that's maybe like 2.5 feet in height and then just drop off and land. And that creates a gnarly stimulus for bone.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
but I think get a lot of these young females back to, playing and having it be somewhat unstructured, I think would also be helpful.
Yeah, it's actually really fun that you just bring that up, because I spend a lot of time at the playground right now. And I think honestly, like, find a young person, like, because they're jumping off a lot of stuff. My 3 and 5-year-old, and now I'm like, I need to jump off that stuff. And so I'm starting to jump off stuff again. And it's like, how often do we, in the last summit, I had an incredible woman, Janet Olmstead, and she's all about play. And I'm like, this is such an important point to always keep coming back to, is like, look at the things around us too. And what you're talking to so much is a diversity of movement and how we move, and like all the ways that we move. And we become so focused in our athletic endeavors on the moving in the sport that we're moving in, and running, biking, swimming, whatever it might be for you. And that to remember that training includes all this diversity and variety of play as well, which will just aid you in such an incredible way. I have one more question that I really want to get to, because I think it's an important one. Moving from mileage and pace to perceived exertion. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and this is something I think it's finally starting to become a little bit more accepted. So, anytime you're talking to runners, I mean, and you talk about their training, they're going to tout the high volume weeks, right? Like, oh, I hit 60 miles this week, I hit 70. Or if you talk about, their training intensity, it's typically going to be described in minutes per mile or kilometers per mile, or kilometers per minute. And I think that can become a slippery slope pretty fast. So rating of perceived exertion is starting to get a little bit more press. There's a nice paper from Max Paquette and Rich Willey in the Journal of Orthopedic Sports Physical Therapy that, made a really strong case in terms of why we should be using RPE as well as duration. So that allows us to essentially calculate what's called a training impulse. So you're capturing the internal loads and the external load. So external load duration in minutes, internal load RPE. And RPE is one of these things, the best athletes in the world, I'm sure with your background, a lot of your training was based off of RPE. And maybe you were using heart rate, maybe you were using power and correlating these. But the RPE scale is just 0 to 10. And I have a great infographic that I can share. But your 4 out of 10 may be a little bit different day to day. So, say if you had a good night's sleep, you were adequately fueled, no crazy stressors going into a workout. Well, your 4 out of 10 may be a little bit more brisk that day. What happens if, you were out, maybe you had a drink, you didn't get good night's sleep, you're underfueled, you have something stressful going on. Maybe you're at a point in the month where you're hitting your cycle, you're dealing with menstrual cramps. Well, that 4 out of 10 is probably going to look a little bit different. So it's just a really nimble and pragmatic way of managing your training intensity that will reflect your ecosystem. And I think sometimes people may initially have a tough time getting acquainted with RPE, but once they do, I think they find it really effective and liberating. Most of the coaching programs, actually almost all of them, are really grounded in RPE. And I think all this technology, what we start to realize when we really scrutinize these algorithms is that they are flawed. All right. And that's putting it lightly. I mean, we used to
Mhm.
look at stuff like bone impact, trying to get some sort of index with the wearables to say, is this person going to be at a greater risk of sustaining a bone stress injury? But the algorithm didn't account for muscular contractions, which create the greatest stimulus on bone. So I think that if people are really wed to a lot of the wearables and the tech, that it can really set the stage for trouble. And RPE, I mean, I want to get the athletes I work with more connected with their sensory system, because we're always trying to hack it. Why not get more acquainted with it?
Yeah, it's super important. So say you have, I'm just super curious. Okay, so an athlete has a hard intensity tempo workout on the schedule, and they had a stressful day, and say it's a zone. Okay, we're just going to get into some details here. So
Yeah.
let's say it's a zone, I call it my zone 3, so where it's a tempo range. It's not threshold, it's below tempo, or it's kind of going in that range, and it's more race specific. I'm going to give you a really specific example.
Sure.
And it's more race specific because you're looking at trying to extend out that tolerance at that point and build up that, not just it's the physical confidence that they can hold race pace.
Mhm.
And man, they had a tough day. And they, typically in this zone 3, it would be an RPE of 5 out of 10. But it's feeling like it's a 6 or a 7. What do you tell your athletes when they're coming into that and be like, okay, well, what would you say to your athletes?
I would put it back on them. And
Yeah.
this is where the dialogue unfolds. And this is what
Mhm.
coaches who are masterful at their craft do, to say, look, how'd the run go today? And not to attach judgment to it, but if
Mhm.
someone's like, oh, man, I thought that I was going to hit these paces, and that 5 out of 10, like I was just sluggish out there, to say, that's interesting. I appreciate you sharing that with me. Why do you think that? Why do you think that that felt like a much more challenging effort than you otherwise expected? And they'll start to basically come up with their explanations. And
Mhm.
that's a dialogue that I don't think happens a lot, because a lot of times coaches will sit behind a computer and just plug in workouts. But you want to get them to embrace the reality of their situation. So um,
Mhm.
yeah, and then maybe they turn around a week later and do the same workout, and they're like, they crush it.
Nailed
And
it. Yeah.
hey, what was it that allowed you to just run, and have such a great workout? Because they'll start basically putting patterns together. People aren't dumb. So I think it forces them to say, well, geez, when I get a good night's sleep and I nix alcohol from the equation, or I'm fueling properly and I'm taking time to get out for a walk over the course of the day, that, geez, I seem to run a lot better, versus if I'm running myself ragged trying to do too many things in life. And you want them to arrive at their own conclusions. So yeah, and that's a great example.
Yeah, I think it's so perfect because it's exactly what in my program, that's what we do in Project 51, is like, learn your body, come into understanding, like, what does this mean? What does a zone 3 mean? How do you target your training? And then how do we understand how we come into that training? How do we come into that stimulus? How do we come into the experience? How do we keep pushing forward so that we can actually see progression in the ways that we want to see progression? And it doesn't always mean that we want to get faster, because quite frankly, some people just don't want to get faster. They just want to keep going. But let's make sure we can keep going and understand that. So I think that is really awesome. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on today that you think is really important for this, athletes in perimenopause and beyond, those that are active, want to, you want them to know? And
I think just to realize that this is a game of longevity, and I think that there's a lot that we don't know too, and we're starting to learn a lot more about fatigue mechanisms. The differences between men and women over the course of the lifespan, and I was around a lot of research when I was at NISMAT in New York, and we were looking at fatigue mechanisms, and men and women fatigue differently. If we think of cyclists, With women, there's a lot of central fatigue. With men, there's a combination of peripheral, meaning in the muscle, as well as central in the brain. Also, that women tend to be a little bit more fatigue resistant than men with resistance training. So you can give them maybe another set or two. They don't need the same amount of rest that a lot of men do. And they respond marvelously well when they're challenged and they're loaded appropriately. And I also think that there's some amazing women who are strength coaches, and as well as men, but I think to surround yourself with people who are going to challenge you, and to also immerse yourself in a community of like-minded people who aren't going to treat you like this delicate flower that you're not.
Yeah, I love that. I just love that. I could keep asking you many, many questions, because honestly, I just absolutely, I just really appreciate the work and the work that you're doing to get your work out into the world. And is there, you're coming up with a couple of things that are really exciting to share. Is there anything else that you wanted to share, RunWell, or in your RunWell pillars?
Yeah, well, I mean, I just RunWell is the main platform that I'm trying to get a lot of this information out, and we just launched it, and we're going to be expanding that website to a number of different things, talking about basically pre and postpartum running. We're going to be talking about fueling considerations. There's a woman, just to give her a plug, Becca McConville, who is awesome. Any female athlete should be familiar with her. And she's in Kansas City, but she wrote a book called Finding Your Sweet Spot. So if people ever need to connect with an RD, she's someone that I lean heavily on, because she's just brilliant. But I think just surrounding yourself with people like that, and realizing that there are so many incredible women that are well positioned to come alongside you and really understand your needs, and set you up for success now and in the future.
Yeah, I love it that you mentioned Rebecca, because we did have her as a speaker in a previous series, and she was incredibly generous and shared as a free gift that the Finding Your Sweet Spot, and I know that all my athletes have access to, and it's really she is a foundation and brilliant human. So I'm glad that you gave her a shout out, and that she's part of your work, and that this is the beauty of collaboration, right? And what we get to do. It's awesome. All right, I have a couple of rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
Yeah.
What in your work or learning are you really excited about at this time?
I'm reading Bud Winter's book, Relax and Win. And I'm trying to really figure out how you put someone on the starting line where they're loose. They're like a Muhammad Ali, because I think that's when people's best performances, are delivered.
That's really gorgeous.
Yeah, I read a lot outside of, I have a background in science and research, but I look a lot to coaches who are in the trenches with athletes, who have basically helped people have these just incredible performances. So
and to see what they're doing that is different than others. I love it, because we're really, we're in the peak of performance right now in the triathlon world. So Kona just happened. I have an athlete going to the World Championship 70.3. I just had another athlete who was at Arizona. Like we're racing right now, and the fall races are happening, and this idea of taper, and this idea of how do we come into our body, how do we be okay being rested, like truly rested, and not feeling nervous that you're losing an edge. And we're having all these conversations within the team element, and just saying, okay, like, what does that mean to be activated and ready, and to your point, loose. And then reflecting on some of the other athletes that you saw racing, and were so wound up and so tight and so on edge, and that just how it doesn't serve. So super interesting. All right, what is one thing you're grateful for?
I am grateful for trusting in myself and the body's ability to adapt. I was told when I was in my late teens and early 20s that I essentially would need knee replacements in my mid 30s, that distance running was out of the question, that I was going to have to hang up my tennis rackets. And so I am grateful for, excuse my language, having a holy shit moment and realizing that that is not the case. And when you create the right environment, that the body adapts, and it's just an incredible thing.
Oh, what a beautiful message to give to these listeners.
Yeah.
Right? Like we're adaptation machines, women are just generally. And then at this life stage, it is all about that. And it is coming into and relearning and accepting, and it is pushing forward. And as you said, loading, and so many things. Oh my goodness, I love it. Okay. What is one principle that you live by?
Be a resource, and you're only as good as your last injury and to the extent you rehabbed it. My physical therapy career revolves around helping people who come to see me because of incomplete rehab, and they're discharged from care prematurely, and that can happen for a variety of reasons, especially if insurance is in the mix. But to really make sure that you completely rehab these injuries, and you're working with people who know what constitutes complete rehab. Because a lot of the times, what's a major predictor for future injury? Previous injury. So if you had a muscle tear or muscle strain in the past, you're more likely to deal with a muscle strain of that particular structure. If you've had a bone stress injury in the past, you're at a greater likelihood of sustaining a future bone stress injury. So just make sure you completely rehab things, and realize that things take time, right? As much as we'd love to rush the process, things take time, and especially with bone stress injuries and tendon disorders. So helping people really manage their expectations and not say, oh, we're going to just miraculously take your pain away. Say, look, this is going to be a long haul. Get ready to saddle up. There's going to be some peaks and valleys here, but as long as we stay the course, you're going to get on the other side of it.
I have to ask you a question about that because it's just so brilliant. Would you say, like, there are some, like, let's like take plantar fasciitis or something that just seems to plague people forever and ever. Is there a point where or is there any injuries that you would say, like, you need to continue, we need to keep rehabbing, like setting you for your foundation doesn't actually go away? I don't know if it's the towel grabs or if it's the whatever we're looking at. Is there some instances where rehab is just the foundation of your exercises, where we keep to have spinal mobility, so we have X, Y, or Z?
Yeah, I think the main thing with a lot of these injuries is to figure out what the entry point is to loading someone. So if someone's running and they have plantar fasciitis or plantar fasciopathy, and they're able to tolerate running, well, don't shut them down from running. Keep them going, but realize that it's really important how you're staggering the workouts and then what they're doing outside of running. If we stick with the theme of tendons need load over time. It needs to be direct, dynamic, and progressive. And while also reminding people that tendons take time. So, I think a lot of clinicians are quick to try and shut someone down who's a runner, and you don't need to. A lot of the times we can just help people manage the fact that they're dealing with increased sensitivity. Maybe we use cadence to basically reduce the magnitude of loading to keep someone running. Maybe we, have them incorporate some walk runs, keep them away from steep hills, keep them away from speed work, because as long as they're able to enjoy consistent and moderate training, they'll get on the other side of things. But I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, well, it totally, actually, I mean, it's a perfect answer for it. Just couldn't keep going. This is where I'm just like, oh, I don't know, like, I don't want to let you go. It's beautiful. I guess it's like, are there things, let me ask it this way. Are there things that you believe we all should always be doing regardless?
Yeah, walking, sleeping, fueling appropriately, resistance training, and immersing yourself in a community and having some sort of hobby or activity outside of your primary sport. So I think one of the greatest challenges and gravest responsibilities I have in working with an athlete is to get them to broaden their identity. So if they get an injury, that it doesn't negatively impact their identity. So, if someone's sidelined from training, they're like, I don't know what I'm going to do. I was, my whole life revolved around running. I'm like, well, isn't this an opportunity to learn something about yourself, to maybe reconnect with some friends you haven't had a chance to see in a while, to maybe pick up a book or pick up a hobby? And there was an incredible piece written by Niels van der Poel, who won the 10K in the recent Olympics, and he talked a lot about his training schedule and how people are like, oh, what are you going to do after skating? It's like, I'm going to carry on with my life the way I always have. He has a
So this is my lifestyle.
He goes skiing. Yeah, he does trail running. So, I think people all too often, they go all in on a sport, and I think that becomes a very slippery slope, and I think it puts a lot of pressure on people where they could keep things a little bit more loose. And if I can instill this in a lot of younger athletes, because I think they start to find success in a sport, and then all of a sudden it becomes their identity, and people say, oh, there's Susie or Bobby, and oh, they're such a great runner, they're such a great triathlete. And it's like, no, there's a person behind that athletic identity, but everyone else will start to identify you around that too. And it's just, again, getting people to broaden their identity so they have a healthy relationship with sport.
Yeah, perfect. I'm going to leave it there. I can't thank you enough for joining us, giving us time amidst a really busy schedule. So thank you. Anything else you want to say?
No, I really appreciate you having me on. It's interesting just how our perspectives change over the course of time, and right now, as a young father, I have a 4 and a 6-year-old, as much as, I love training and racing, the thing that I think is most important is for them to, when they walk by me in the morning, to see me lifting some heavy weight, to be on my bike, where they're like, there's dad lifting again, or riding his bike, where they see that and it's normalized. So, because, these kids are sponges, and they'll start to pick up on that stuff quick.
Oh, don't they? It's a beautiful thing. And yeah, it's a big responsibility to hold true as well. Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah. I will never put pressure on. I'm very laissez-faire with, in terms of how I handle my kids. And, my daughter was in gymnastics, and, we were going to put her into the advanced program, which is 3 hours. And she went to I think she went to 2 classes, and she's like, I don't really want to do this. We're like, great, that's fine. You don't need to do it. Is there something else you'd want to do? And she's like, yeah, I want to, take up ballet, and I want to play some tennis. I'm like, awesome. Let's put you in them.
There we go.
Yeah, for these kids to develop a rich repertoire of movement where they get exposed to a lot of different things, because not only do they learn what they like and they're around a peer group, but they also start to figure out how their body behaves in different settings and planes. And, because I think they'll start to figure out what they really enjoy. And, if they have success at it, if they get, a scholarship to college, great. But if not, great.
Yeah.
As long as they're happy and they develop a healthy relationship with movement, that's all that I care about.
And it's funny, like, to bring it back to the female athletes in perimenopause and beyond. That's what we need to think about too. Like, it echoes through all of our lives, like as we go through transition, as we develop. And you just said that, as we, I'm learning so much, and we get like, let's come back to that play. Let's come back to, how do you be in your body? And if you don't like something, try something else. Yeah. Like, we have to give ourselves so much more freedom. And there's principles like you gave us, what are your principles and cores that you start with, and let's keep those and play. It's gorgeous. Well, thank you so much.
I'll leave you with one other thing too. I was walking home from the park the other day, and this young girl was, they were packing up the car with her mom, and she said, why are boys better at sports than girls? And, I just was sort of eavesdropping, and her mom's like, well, why do you say it? And I said, they're not, and her mom looked over, and she was like nodding her head, yeah, I can't wait to see. And I think a lot of this stems from basically how delayed Title IX was. But a lot of these studies that be published in the upcoming years, I think we're going to see, I mean, my thoughts are that a lot of the bone health and compromised bone health and bone stress injuries that I see in a lot of young females, not to say they don't hit males, but I think that that's a function of a lot of societal issues that we're slowly getting away from. And there are other issues now, don't get me wrong, in terms of like what the ideal body is and all that nonsense. But yeah, I think just reminding women that they are tough as nails, and I actually think that they're better competitors than men in a lot of instances. And we're seeing this in the trail running world, especially. So women are just really starting to like raise eyebrows, like, geez. And it's interesting when you look at a lot of the masters level and female jerry athletes, is they tend to hold on to performance longer than men do. You know, we talk about calf capacity. Women tend to maintain their calf capacity for a longer period of time than men do. So, you know, and there's a scarcity of studies right now really looking at older females, and that's why I'm eager to really follow that line of literature over the next several decades.
Oh, well, this is awesome. Okay, so you heard it here. You're tough as nails. We've got this, and our calves last longer. I'm just going to like summarize.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Remember,
so much.
Chelsea Sodero, the woman who won Kona, is a mom, right? No one had her on the radar.
No one. Hey, like, isn't it just phenomenal? So beautiful. All right. Well, thank you.